Ethan Carter never expected to find life on this dead world. His ship had crash-landed on the barren surface of Bravery, a planet long abandoned after some forgotten war. The air was thin but breathable, the sky a dull gray with swirling clouds that cast strange shifting shadows over the ruins ahead. He had no choice but to move. His distress beacon was damaged, his supplies were limited, and he needed shelter before the freezing night set in. He pushed forward through the crumbling remains of an ancient city, his boots crunching over debris. The buildings were massive but skeletal, their alien architecture resembling twisted spires and smooth, unnatural curves. The silence was heavy, except for the occasional sound of wind moaning through the hollowed-out structures. But as he stepped over a broken pathway, something made him freeze. A sound, faint, almost lost in the wind. A breath. Someone was here. Ethan tightened his grip on his blaster and turned toward the source. His eyes scanned the ruins ahead, searching for movement. He took slow, cautious steps toward a collapsed archway where the sound had come from. As he peered inside, his breath caught in his throat. A figure lay motionless against the cold stone. She wasn't human. Her skin was a pale silver, almost metallic under the dim light, with deep violet markings that pulsed faintly along her arms and neck. Her hair, dark as midnight, spilled around her delicate face, which was marred by scratches and dried blood. Her robes, once elegant and flowing, were torn and caked with dust. She looked fragile, as if she had been lying there for days. Ethan crouched beside her, scanning for any signs of life. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. She was barely holding on. His fingers brushed against her wrist, checking for a pulse. Weak, but there. Who was she? And why was she here, abandoned like the ruins around her? Her eyelids fluttered, and a soft, pained sound escaped her lips. Ethan leaned in, his voice low but firm. "Hey, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened just a fraction, large and glowing violet, filled with something between fear and exhaustion. She tried to speak, but no words came. Her fingers twitched, as if trying to reach for something. "It's okay," Ethan assured her, though he wasn't sure if it really was. "You're not alone." But before she could respond, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the ruins. Ethan tensed, his eyes darting to the shadows beyond. The sound was unmistakable. Something was watching them. And it wasn't friendly. Ethan didn't have time to think. The guttural growl sent a chill through his spine as he instinctively shifted, positioning himself between the wounded alien woman and whatever lurked in the shadows. He slowly reached for his sidearm, his pulse quickening. The ruins had seemed deserted, but he knew better than to assume safety on an unfamiliar planet. He glanced down at the woman. Her breath was shallow, her body trembling. She was in no condition to move, much less run. But leaving her here wasn't an option. His gut told him that whoever she was, she didn't belong in this wasteland. Someone had left her here to die. "Hold on," he muttered under his breath, sliding one arm under her shoulders. She stirred slightly, her violet eyes fluttering open just enough to look at him in confusion. She was lighter than he expected, though her body radiated an unnatural warmth. Ethan gritted his teeth as he lifted her up, securing her against his chest. The growling grew louder. Ethan turned toward the shadows where the noise had come from. At first, he saw nothing, just jagged stone, and the skeletal remains of structures long abandoned. But then he noticed movement, something shifting unnaturally in the darkness. A pair of glowing yellow eyes locked onto him. Not friendly. He didn't wait to find out what it was. He turned sharply, adjusting his grip on the woman as he sprinted through the ruins. His boots slammed against the cracked ground, kicking up dust as he wove through the wreckage. The creature let out a guttural snarl, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against stone. It was following them. Ethan cursed under his breath. His crashed ship wasn't far, but it wasn't functional either. Still, it was his best shot at getting out of this alive. He pushed forward, his muscles burning as he carried the alien woman in his arms. She stirred again, her fingers weakly clutching at his jacket. "Stay with me," Ethan urged. "We're almost there." The ship came into view, a dented, scorched wreck resting between two crumbling towers. Smoke still curled from one of its engines, and the hull was battered beyond repair. It wasn't going anywhere, but it was still shelter. Ethan reached the ramp and stumbled inside, kicking the door control as he did. The metal hatch groaned, slowly sealing shut just as the creature outside lunged forward. A heavy thud echoed through the cabin as something massive slammed against the exterior. The beast snarled and clawed at the door, but the reinforced metal held. For now, Ethan let out a breath and lowered the alien woman onto a padded bench near the cockpit. He took a moment to assess her condition. Her breathing was labored, her silver skin marred with bruises and scratches. Whoever she was, she had been through hell. He moved quickly, grabbing a medical scanner from a nearby compartment. The device whirred to life, its blue light sweeping over her form. Ethan frowned at the readings: dehydration, severe exhaustion, and signs of malnutrition. But there was something else. Her body was rejecting the atmosphere. "Damn it," Ethan muttered. This planet had barely enough oxygen to support humans. But for her, it was killing her slowly. He rummaged through his supplies, grabbing a small oxygen mask. Carefully, he placed it over her nose and mouth, adjusting the settings. After a few moments, her breathing evened out slightly. Her violet eyes opened again, more focused this time. She looked at Ethan with confusion, then at the ship's dim interior. Her voice was barely above a whisper, soft yet melodic. "Human." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, you're safe, for now." She flinched at his words, a flicker of fear crossing her face. She tried to move, but her body was too weak to resist. Ethan held up a hand. "Easy. I'm not here to hurt you." Her eyes studied him, searching for something. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his short, dust-covered hair. "What's your name?" For a moment, she hesitated. Then, in a voice barely strong enough to be heard, she whispered, "Saria." Ethan nodded. "All right, Saria. Mind telling me why you were left for dead in the middle of nowhere?" She closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering her strength. When she spoke again, her words sent a shiver through him. "They abandoned me," she murmured. "My own people." Ethan frowned. "Why?" Her lips parted, but before she could answer, a sharp beeping sound filled the cabin. Ethan turned toward the control panel. His sensors had picked up movement. Not just one signal. Dozens. His jaw tightened. They weren't alone. And whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't finished with them yet. Ethan barely had time to process what Saria had just told him before the sharp beeping from his scanner pulled his attention back to the present danger. His fingers moved swiftly over the control panel, eyes narrowing as the readings became clearer. The movement outside wasn't just the single creature he had escaped from. It was more. Many more. The scanner picked up multiple heat signatures, closing in fast. His gut twisted. The thing that had chased them through the ruins wasn't just a lone predator. It was part of a pack. Ethan turned back to Saria, who lay weakly on the bench, her violet eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. She needed rest, medical care, and proper oxygen levels. But none of that would matter if they didn't make it out of here alive. "You said your people abandoned you," Ethan said, checking his blaster. "That mean they're not coming back for you?" She exhaled softly, her gaze distant. They left me here to die." Ethan clenched his jaw. He didn't know what had happened to her, but he knew betrayal when he heard it. It didn't matter whether she was human or not. No one deserved to be thrown away like that. Outside, something let out a long guttural howl. The sound reverberated through the hull of his wrecked ship, and the scratching of claws against metal soon followed. "They found us," he muttered. Saria tried to sit up, wincing as her weakened muscles protested. "The Krell," she whispered. "They hunt in packs. They do not stop until they've devoured everything." Ethan swore under his breath. That explained the glowing yellow eyes he had seen in the ruins. He had assumed the creature was just some feral predator, but if these things hunted in groups, they weren't just scavengers. They were apex predators. The ship shook as something heavy slammed against it. A second later, another impact. Ethan grabbed his rifle from a side compartment, strapping it across his chest, before turning back to Saria. "We can't stay here," he said. "This ship isn't spaceworthy, and it won't hold against those things for long." Her breathing hitched. "Then where will we go?" "There's an old human outpost about 2 clicks west of here," Ethan replied. "Built during the last war. If it's still intact, it might have defenses." Saria hesitated, then nodded. "Then we should move. Now." Ethan helped her to her feet, but the moment she tried to stand, her legs buckled. He caught her just in time, her body lighter than he expected, as if she weighed almost nothing. She tried to push away from him, frustrated by her own weakness, but Ethan shook his head. "No time for pride. You can barely walk," he said. "I'll carry you." Before she could protest, he lifted her up into his arms. She stiffened at first, but soon relaxed, too drained to fight him on it. Another deep guttural snarl echoed through the cabin. Then came the unmistakable sound of metal tearing. The Krell were trying to claw their way in. Ethan cursed. "We're going out the back." He moved swiftly, carrying Saria toward the emergency hatch. As he reached for the control panel, the ship rocked violently. Something had ripped through a section of the hull. The stale air inside was immediately filled with the scent of something foul, like rotting meat mixed with sulfur. Saria tensed in his arms. "They're inside." Ethan didn't hesitate. He slammed the hatch release, and the door hissed open. Cold night air rushed in, and he stepped out onto the planet's surface, his boots crunching against gravel and debris. Then he ran. The ruins stretched ahead of him like a maze of broken stone and twisted metal. Behind him, he could hear the screeches of the Krell, their claws clattering against the wreckage as they realized their prey had escaped. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The adrenaline pumping through his veins told him everything he needed to know. They were coming. Saria clung to him weakly, her breathing ragged. "Faster," she whispered, barely audible over the howls. Ethan pushed himself harder, weaving through the ruins, jumping over broken pathways and ducking beneath fallen beams. Every step sent a jolt of pain through his legs, but he didn't slow down. The outpost was close. It had to be. A sudden screech to his left made his instincts scream. Without thinking, he twisted his body, narrowly dodging a set of razor-sharp claws that slashed through the air where his head had been just moments ago. One of the Krell had cut ahead of him, its massive, hunched form emerging from the shadows like a nightmare made flesh. Its eyes glowed like molten gold, its mouth filled with jagged, serrated teeth. It let out a chittering hiss, its muscles coiling as it prepared to lunge. Ethan didn't give it the chance. He fired. The first shot struck its shoulder, sending it reeling back. The second hit its chest, but the thing barely flinched. Its thick, armored hide absorbed most of the impact. "Not good," Ethan muttered. The Krell let out a furious shriek and charged. Ethan's reflexes kicked in. He twisted his body, using his momentum to throw himself to the side, just barely avoiding the creature's massive claws. He landed hard, the impact jolting Saria in his arms. Before the Krell could turn on him again, a sharp whistling sound cut through the air, then a boom. The creature screeched in agony as a chunk of the ruins above it suddenly collapsed, burying it under a cascade of heavy debris. Ethan didn't waste time questioning his luck. He scrambled to his feet and kept running. Saria, her voice barely above a whisper, murmured, "The outpost. I see it." Ethan followed her gaze. There, just beyond the next ridge, was the outline of an old human military bunker. Its walls were partially collapsed, but the entrance looked intact. They had a chance. But as they neared the bunker, a realization sank in. The Krell weren't giving up. Their howls grew louder, echoing through the ruins. The pack was still coming, and they weren't far behind. Ethan pushed himself harder, his muscles burning with the effort. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, but he refused to slow down. Saria's body was light in his arms, but he could feel the uneven rhythm of her breathing against his chest. She was struggling to stay conscious, her fingers weakly gripping the fabric of his jacket, as if trying to ground herself in the moment. The howls of the Krell filled the air behind them, their guttural snarls growing closer with each passing second. The bunker was just ahead now, an old human military outpost from a war long forgotten. Its reinforced metal doors were still intact, but parts of the outer walls had crumbled away, exposing dark corridors to the lifeless planet. It didn't matter. If they could get inside and seal the doors, they might have a chance. Ethan's boots slammed against the cracked pavement as he reached the entrance. He shifted Saria's weight slightly, freeing one arm to slam his fist against the control panel beside the door. The screen flickered to life, displaying a long-dead system barely clinging to power. Come on, he muttered, pressing several commands in rapid succession. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a loud hiss, the reinforced doors groaned and began to slide open at a painfully slow pace. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The Krell were too close. He could hear their claws scraping against stone, hear their growls reverberating through the air. He turned his head just enough to see dark, twisted shapes moving in the distance, their glowing yellow eyes fixed on him. They weren't just running, they were hunting. The door was barely halfway open when Ethan made his decision. He ducked down, sliding through the narrow gap while holding Saria close. The moment they were inside, he spun around and slammed his hand against the emergency override. Sparks flew as the mechanism engaged, and the door began sealing shut just as the first Krell lunged. A deafening bang echoed through the bunker as something massive crashed against the exterior. The door shuddered but held firm. Another slam, followed by the sound of claws scraping against metal. The Krell were furious. They had been robbed of their prey. Ethan didn't move until the pounding against the door began to fade. Slowly, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For now, they were safe. He turned his attention back to Saria, gently lowering her onto the cold floor. Her silver skin had lost some of its glow, and her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. He couldn't ignore the way she trembled, her body barely holding onto consciousness. "Stay with me," Ethan murmured as he pulled off his jacket and draped it over her. Her violet eyes fluttered open just enough to meet his gaze. "You should have left me," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with something he couldn't quite place. Ethan frowned. "Not happening." She exhaled shakily. "You don't understand. I am not worth saving." His jaw tightened. He didn't know much about her, but he had seen enough to know that whatever had happened to her, whatever had led her to be left on this godforsaken planet, had shattered something inside her. He sat back against the wall, resting for a moment as he glanced around the dark interior of the bunker. The place was old, but the layout was familiar enough. Human design, built for war. A command center was likely deeper inside, possibly with working systems if there was any power left. First things first, he had to make sure she was stable. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small medical kit. Flipping it open, he took out a portable scanner and ran it over her body. The readings weren't good. Dehydration, oxygen deprivation, and exhaustion had taken their toll. Her body was desperately trying to hold on, but she wouldn't last long without proper care. Ethan frowned. "Your body's not adapting well to the atmosphere." She swallowed, her gaze unfocused. "It is not meant for me." That wasn't good. If her biology couldn't sustain itself on this planet, she was running out of time. Ethan pulled out a hydration pack and gently pressed it against her lips. "Drink," he instructed. She hesitated for only a moment before weakly complying. The cool liquid slid down her throat, and though it wasn't much, it was enough to ease some of the tension in her body. Silence settled between them for a long moment before Ethan finally broke it. "You said your people abandoned you," he said quietly. "Why?" Saria closed her eyes briefly, as if the weight of the question was too much. But when she finally spoke, there was no anger in her voice, only quiet resignation. "I was born into a ruling house," she murmured, "a daughter of warlords." Ethan didn't speak, letting her continue. "My people, they were conquerors. They believed strength was all that mattered, that only the strongest deserved to survive." She exhaled, the faintest tremor in her voice. "I was not strong enough." Ethan frowned. "You don't seem weak to me." She gave him a tired, almost bitter smile. Strength to them meant conquest, killing without hesitation, ruling through fear. Her eyes darkened. "I questioned it. I refused to fight in a war I did not believe in." Ethan remained quiet, watching as her gaze drifted toward the ceiling. "They saw me as a disgrace," she whispered, "a failure. My own brother led the charge to have me exiled. He left me here, knowing I would die." Ethan exhaled slowly. He had seen war, seen what power-hungry leaders did to those who refused to fall in line. But something about the way she spoke, the quiet pain in her voice, made his gut twist in a way he didn't expect. "You deserved better," he said simply. Saria let out a quiet, almost bitter laugh. "Deserve has nothing to do with it." Ethan leaned his head back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. "Well," he said after a moment, "you're not dead yet." She turned her head toward him, her violet eyes searching his face. "No, I suppose I am not." Silence fell between them again, but this time it was less heavy. After a while, Ethan glanced toward the interior of the bunker. They needed to move deeper inside, find supplies, maybe even a working terminal. But before he could stand, Saria spoke again. "You saved me," she said softly. "Why?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He didn't have a perfect reason, no grand speech about morality or heroism. Finally, he looked at her and shrugged. "Because no one deserves to be left behind." She studied him for a long moment. Then, for the first time since he had found her, she closed her eyes without the weight of fear dragging her down. Ethan exhaled and turned toward the darkness ahead. They weren't out of danger yet. The Krell were still out there. And somewhere, across the void, the people who had abandoned Saria were still watching. One way or another, this wasn't over. Ethan sat in the dimly lit interior of the bunker, his back against the cold metal wall as he listened to the silence. The pounding on the outer door had faded, but he wasn't naive enough to believe they were safe. The Krell were patient hunters, and they didn't give up easily. The creatures knew they were inside, and they were likely circling, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Saria's breathing had steadied somewhat, though she was still weak. The hydration pack had helped, and the oxygen mask had kept her from slipping further into unconsciousness. She had drifted into a light sleep, her silver skin dimming slightly as her body struggled to recover. Ethan didn't know how long they could stay here, but he did know one thing. This bunker was their only real chance of survival. His gaze flicked toward the interior corridors stretching deeper into the outpost. If they were lucky, some of the old systems might still be functional. If there was an armory, they could restock on weapons. If there was a command center, they might be able to send a distress signal. And if they weren't lucky, Ethan didn't want to think about that. With a sigh, he pushed himself to his feet, stretching his sore muscles. His body ached from the chase, but there was no time to rest. He needed to find something, anything, that could help them. He took a step forward, but before he could move further, the low hum of an energy field crackled to life. Ethan froze. A moment later, a voice rang out through the bunker's speakers, cold and precise. "Human detected," and "Valkyrie." The voice was unfamiliar, but it sent a chill through him. It wasn't automated. Someone was watching. Saria stirred at the sound, her violet eyes fluttering open. She sat up weakly, her body still sluggish, But the moment she heard the voice, all traces of exhaustion were replaced by fear. "No," she whispered. "It's them." Ethan's hand went to his blaster instinctively. "Who?" Before she could answer, the bunker's main doors groaned as something massive began to shift. Lights flickered on overhead, illuminating the long-abandoned corridors with a dull yellow glow. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by the sudden activation of the facility's ancient systems. Then the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the halls. Ethan spun around, his grip tightening on his weapon. Saria struggled to stand, her body trembling as she pulled herself upright. The footsteps grew louder. Shadows stretched against the walls. And then, emerging from the darkness, came a group of figures clad in sleek black armor. Valkyrie. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. These weren't just any soldiers. Their armor bore the insignia of nobility. Elite warriors, battle-hardened and lethal. At the front of the group, a tall figure stepped forward, his silver skin reflecting the dim light. His deep violet eyes locked onto Saria with something between amusement and cold detachment. "Sister," he said, his voice smooth and unbothered. "I see you've survived longer than expected." Saria's breath hitched. "Veros," she whispered. Ethan didn't need to ask. This was her brother, the one who had left her to die. Veros tilted his head slightly, his gaze flicking toward Ethan. "And a human saved you. How?" "Poetic." Ethan stepped forward, his blaster still aimed. "I don't know what kind of family issues you've got going on here, but I'm guessing you didn't come all this way to apologize." Veros chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, I did not." He gestured lazily to the soldiers flanking him. "Take them both. Kill the human if he resists." Ethan moved before they could. He grabbed Saria's wrist and yanked her backward just as the first shot rang out. Energy blasts sizzled through the air, striking the metal walls behind them. Ethan fired back, hitting one of the soldiers in the shoulder and sending him crashing to the ground. Saria stumbled, but Ethan didn't let her fall. He dragged her deeper into the bunker, ducking behind a stack of old crates as more shots rang out. Sparks flew from the walls as energy bolts ricocheted off the metal surfaces. "They want me alive," Saria gasped, clutching at Ethan's arm. "You, they will kill." "Yeah, I figured that part out," Ethan muttered, checking his blaster. "Only a few shots left." "Not good." Veros's voice echoed through the halls. "You're only delaying the inevitable, sister. You've always been weak. That human can't protect you." Ethan gritted his teeth. "I hate this guy already." Saria's hands clenched into fists. For the first time since Ethan had found her, a fire lit in her violet eyes. "I am not weak," she whispered. Then, before Ethan could stop her, she turned and stepped out from behind the crates. Veros barely had time to react before Saria raised her hand. A pulse of energy rippled through the air, sending a shockwave crashing into the soldiers. The force was so strong it lifted two of them off their feet, slamming them against the far wall. Ethan's eyes widened. Saria swayed slightly, her body still weak, but her power was undeniable. Veros narrowed his eyes, brushing dust from his shoulder as if unimpressed. "I see you still remember some of your gifts," he said coolly, "but it won't be enough." Ethan didn't wait for him to make a move. He grabbed Saria's wrist and pulled her back. "Let's go." They ran. The corridors twisted and turned, the old bunker stretching far deeper than Ethan had initially thought. The sound of pursuit was close behind. Valkyrie soldiers moving fast, their boots striking against metal as they closed in. Ethan's mind raced. They needed an escape, but in a bunker buried beneath a wasteland, there weren't many options. Then he saw it, a rusted hatch door with an emergency access panel beside it. It looked old, barely functional, but it might be their only chance. He turned to Saria. "Can you open this?" She pressed her palm against the panel, and for a second, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, the door released and slid open. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pulled her through and slammed the door shut behind them. Darkness swallowed them whole. Only the distant echoes of Veros's voice remained. "You can run, sister," he called out, "but you cannot escape your past." Ethan took a breath and turned toward Saria. "Yeah," he muttered. "Well, we'll see about that." The darkness inside the passage was suffocating. The air was thick with dust, and the stale scent of decay clung to the metal walls. Ethan could hear the faint hum of old machinery deep within the bunker, but most of the systems were either dead or barely functional. The emergency lighting flickered erratically, casting shadows that made the narrow corridor feel even more claustrophobic. Saria leaned against the wall, her breath uneven. Her body was still weak from the earlier chase, and using her energy against the Valkyrie soldiers had taken a visible toll. But her eyes, those glowing violet eyes, held a newfound determination. She wasn't broken. Not anymore. Ethan turned his attention back toward the sealed door they had escaped through. Veros and his soldiers were close. They would find another way inside. They weren't going to let Saria go so easily. "We need to keep moving," Ethan whispered, scanning their surroundings. Saria nodded, pushing herself away from the wall. "There should be an auxiliary tunnel system beneath the bunker," she said, her voice still hoarse. "It was built as an escape route in case of invasion." Ethan exhaled. "You better hope it's still intact." They moved quickly through the corridor, careful not to make too much noise. The walls were lined with old, rusted pipes, some of them leaking a faint mist of gas. The deeper they went, the colder it became. It felt like they were walking straight into the heart of a tomb. Ethan kept his blaster raised, his eyes scanning every shadow. He had been in enough war zones to know that enemies weren't always loud. Sometimes, the deadliest threats waited in silence. Saria suddenly stopped, her head tilted slightly, her expression tense. "What?" Ethan asked. She pressed a finger to her lips, then turned her gaze upward. Ethan followed her line of sight. His stomach clenched. Above them, barely visible through the broken metal grating in the ceiling, something was moving. The Krell. They hadn't just been circling the bunker. They had found another way in. Ethan's grip on his weapon tightened. "How many?" Saria inhaled sharply, her violet eyes flickering with an otherworldly glow. "Too many." A deep guttural chittering echoed above them, followed by the soft scratching of claws against metal. The Krell weren't attacking yet. They were waiting. Ethan swallowed hard. "They're hunting us." Saria nodded. "They know we have nowhere else to run." Ethan scanned the corridor ahead. If the Krell dropped down, they would be trapped. Fighting them in close quarters was suicide. He needed an opening, a way out before it was too late. His gaze landed on a rusted access hatch embedded in the wall a few meters away. It was old, dented, and barely hanging on its hinges. But beyond it, he could see the faintest hint of a vertical shaft leading downward. "This way," he whispered, grabbing Saria's hand. She didn't hesitate. Together, they sprinted toward the hatch. The moment they moved, the Krell attacked. With a horrific screech, the creatures above burst through the grating. Their massive insect-like forms dropped from the ceiling, their glowing yellow eyes locking onto Ethan and Saria with a terrifying hunger. The creatures' elongated limbs twitched unnaturally, their sharp claws clicking against the metal floor. Ethan fired first. His blaster lit up the corridor as energy bolts slammed into the closest Krell, sending it reeling backward. But the others kept coming. Saria reached the hatch first. She pressed her hands against the rusted edges, her fingers trembling as she struggled to pry it open. It refused to budge. Ethan fired again, but the Krell were too fast. One lunged, its serrated limbs swiping toward him. He barely managed to duck, rolling out of the way as the creature's claws tore into the wall behind him. "Any time now, Saria," he shouted. She gritted her teeth and threw all her strength into one final push. With a screech of metal, the hatch door gave way. The shaft beneath them yawned open like a black abyss. Ethan didn't think. He grabbed Saria and jumped. They plunged into the darkness, free-falling into the unknown. Cold air rushed past them as the shaft carried them deeper beneath the bunker. Ethan braced himself, trying to slow their descent, but there was nothing to hold on to. Then, impact. They crashed into something solid, rolling across the ground as dust exploded into the air around them. Ethan coughed, wincing as pain flared through his body. Saria groaned beside him, struggling to push herself up. A sharp sound rang out above them. The Krell were still coming. Ethan grabbed Saria's wrist and ran. The underground passage was ancient, lined with long-dead control panels and flickering emergency lights. The deeper they ran, the more the walls became less human and more alien. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, glowing faintly with an eerie blue light. Ethan didn't have time to question it. Behind them, the Krell poured into the shaft, their screeches filling the cavernous space. Then, just as Ethan thought they had reached a dead end, a massive set of doors loomed ahead. Saria staggered forward, her breathing ragged. "That's it," she gasped. "The escape gate." Ethan rushed toward the control panel beside the doors. It was old, alien tech, but it still had power. He pressed a hand against the panel. The screen flickered. Then a voice spoke in an ancient dialect. Saria stepped beside him, her eyes glowing as she answered in the same language. The system hesitated for a moment. Then, with a low hum, the doors began to open. Beyond them was a long, metallic tunnel stretching into the unknown. Ethan exhaled. "Where does it lead?" Saria's expression was unreadable. "Away from here." Behind them, the Krell were almost on top of them. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Saria's hand and ran. The moment they crossed the threshold, the doors sealed shut behind them, locking the creatures out. Silence. Ethan doubled over, trying to catch his breath. Saria leaned against the wall, her chest rising and falling rapidly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan let out a breathless chuckle. Well, that was close. Saria turned to face him. For the first time since he had met her, a small, almost relieved smile crossed her lips. "Yes," she murmured. It was. But their journey wasn't over yet. The tunnel stretched ahead of them, leading into the unknown. And somewhere beyond it, Veros was still waiting. The tunnel stretched endlessly before them, a dimly lit corridor of ancient alien design. The walls pulsed faintly with an eerie blue glow, the symbols carved into them whispering secrets of a long-forgotten civilization. The air was thick, tinged with something unnatural, but compared to the horrors they had left behind, it felt like salvation. Ethan ran a hand through his dust-covered hair, his muscles aching from the relentless chase. His body still hummed with adrenaline, his heart pounding in his chest. They had barely escaped the Krell, barely made it through that door before being torn apart. Now they were alone in the unknown, with only the faint hum of distant machinery surrounding them. Saria leaned against the tunnel wall, her body trembling from exhaustion. Her silver skin, though still marked with scratches and bruises, had regained a slight glow. She was breathing easier, her strength slowly returning. Yet there was something else in her eyes, a quiet sadness, an unspoken weight pressing down on her. Ethan exhaled, shifting his blaster in his grip. "All right, I'll bite. Where the hell are we?" Saria's gaze flickered toward the end of the corridor, where the tunnel seemed to curve downward into darkness. "An escape route," she murmured, her voice steadier than before. "It was built long ago, during the war between my people and yours." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And where exactly does it lead?" Saria hesitated. "It should lead to an underground hangar, one my people once used as a fallback point. If it still exists, there may be a ship." Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly at the word ship. If there was even a chance they could get off this rock, it was worth the risk. He glanced back at the sealed door behind them. The Krell were still out there, trapped for now. But Veros, he wasn't done with them. Ethan knew men like him, arrogant, ruthless, and unwilling to let go of control. He would find a way to track them down. "Then we better move," Ethan said. Saria nodded, pushing herself off the wall. She was still weak, but there was something different about her now. The quiet fear that had once held her captive was gone, replaced by something more resolute. They walked in silence for a while, the tunnel narrowing as they descended deeper underground. The further they went, the older the technology became. Strange conduits lined the ceiling, pulsating faintly, as if alive. The floor was smooth, polished metal, untouched by time. Then, suddenly, the tunnel opened into a massive chamber. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The underground hangar was still intact. It was enormous, large enough to house several ships. But only one remained, a sleek, midnight black vessel, its design unlike any human craft he had ever seen. Its hull shimmered under the dim blue lighting, ancient but pristine. It had been waiting. Saria took a slow step forward, her eyes wide. "It's still here," she whispered, almost in disbelief. Ethan gave a low whistle. "I'll admit, I was expecting a pile of rust. But this might actually fly." Saria moved toward the ship, her hand trailing along its smooth surface. "It is a stealth-class transport," she murmured, "built to evade detection. My people abandoned it long ago." She turned to Ethan, her expression unreadable. "It may be our only way out." Ethan smirked. "Then let's see if it still has some life left." They climbed aboard, moving quickly through the dimly lit corridors of the ship. The interior was just as well preserved as the exterior, sleek, minimalistic, yet unmistakably designed for survival. Ethan made his way to the cockpit, his fingers brushing over the unfamiliar controls. "Can you fly it?" he asked. Saria hesitated before nodding. "I was trained in piloting when I was younger. I can try." She settled into the pilot's seat, her fingers gliding over the console. The controls responded almost immediately, the ship humming to life beneath them. Screens flickered on, glyphs and symbols scrolling across them in a language Ethan couldn't read. Then something on the display made Saria go still. Ethan caught the change in her expression. "What is it?" She swallowed, her hands tightening on the controls. "We are not alone." Ethan's stomach dropped. Define not alone. Saria turned to him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Veros. His ship is in orbit. They are scanning for us." Ethan exhaled sharply. Of course. He had known Veros wouldn't just give up. "We need to launch," Saria said firmly. "Now." Ethan nodded, strapping himself into the co-pilot's seat. "Then let's get the hell out of here." Saria's fingers danced over the controls, and the ship roared to life. The hangar doors groaned, ancient mechanisms struggling to obey long-forgotten commands. Outside, the ground shook. Ethan's heart pounded. "Tell me that's just the engines warming up." Saria's face was tense. "No," she said. "That's Veros." The display showed a drop pod breaking through the atmosphere, heading straight for their location. "They found us," she whispered. Ethan clenched his jaw. "Then let's make sure they don't catch us." Saria punched the thrusters. The ship shot forward, racing toward the opening hangar doors. The drop pod crashed behind them just as they cleared the exit, a fireball of destruction engulfing the cavern they had just escaped. The shockwave sent them spinning for a moment, alarms blaring, but Saria steadied the ship, guiding it toward the sky. Ethan twisted in his seat, watching as Veros's warship loomed in orbit, sleek and menacing. "Can this thing outrun them?" he asked. Saria's lips pressed together. "No, but it can do something better." Ethan arched an eyebrow. "Oh." Saria's hands moved over the controls, activating something hidden within the ship's systems. "It can vanish." A pulse of energy surged through the craft, and in an instant, the ship faded from sight, disappearing from enemy sensors. Ethan blinked. "Okay, that's a neat trick." Saria didn't answer right away. She stared ahead, her expression unreadable as the stars stretched before them. For the first time in her life, she was free. No war, no family to betray her, no chains binding her to a life she never wanted. Ethan exhaled, leaning back in his seat. So, where to? Saria turned to him, a small, almost hesitant smile playing at her lips. Anywhere, she said. And with that, their ship vanished into the stars.